This is the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. Andy Payton is the lead pastor at Methodist Temple United Methodist Church in Evansville, Indiana. Randy Moore is associate pastor at Methodist Temple. Their goal is to see Christ in everything and everyone.
Welcome in, friends, to the podcast. I am Randy Moore, the associate pastor here at Methodist Temple, joined today, as always, in the podcast by the senior pastor at Methodist Temple, the lead pastor, Pastor Andy Payton. And first time we've been together in 2 weeks, so it's good to sit down with you, Pastor Andy.
You called me senior pastor. It's good to be with everyone.
I think I have more gray hairs than you have.
I don't know. Ever since I became the lead pastor / senior pastor, my hair has turned gray.
Well, as I said, it's good to be together again, and so we've got some catching up to do. We're going to test your memory of your own sermon because you're going to have to go back a couple of weeks because we're in this sermon series on the stained glass windows at Methodist Temple, and if you're new, let's just go over that quickly, new to the podcast. We've got at Methodist Temple stained glass windows. On the east wall in the sanctuary are the Beatitudes. On the west wall are some of the parables of Jesus. And so today we come down to the last two Beatitudes that are in Matthew chapter 5, but there are two more additional ones that whoever made the decision about what windows were going to go in there are two more. So
I just wish I could get in a time machine and be like a fly on the wall when we were designing the sanctuary, right? Because it probably didn't happen this way, but I just wonder, like, if they designed the sanctuary and they're like, oh, well, we're going to have to find two more Beatitudes since we got two more windows.
Right.
But
that's like, sure what it looks like.
These last two Beatitudes are kind of like encore Beatitudes because they're not in the Sermon on the Mount, though.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay, and then on the other side of the parables of Jesus, and this sermon series will continue with those. And so, as I said, we come down to the last two that are in the Sermon on the Mount here in chapter 5 of Matthew. And it's kind of an interesting thing to look at as to whether there are 8 Beatitudes in Matthew or are there 9, because you've got, it looks like, 2 Beatitudes about persecution, or maybe what would be the 9th is just, it's just additional information about it. But anyway, so why don't I go ahead and read this, Matthew 5, 1 through 12. This week we have reached, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And then we're going to fold in also, blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. But just to refresh your memory, Matthew 5, 1 through 12. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he began to speak and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And right here is where we could say these are 8 Beatitudes because the first and the 8th both end with, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So, but then it goes on to say, blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Okay, there they are. Yeah. And so 2 weeks ago, you handled Blessed are the Peacemakers.
Yep.
Yeah. So.
They'll be called children of God, is what it says.
Yeah.
Yep. I began the sermon asking a question about, are you interested? And are you interested in what is yours to do? Are you interested in what you have to do? And I talked a little bit about it makes all the difference in the world when our heart is in something and we're really invested and we really desire to do something, whatever that something may be. I think that kind of strikes a chord with what the Beatitudes are trying to get at too. If you look at a lot of the Beatitudes that we just read through just moments ago, you probably noticed that, like, they're internal types of dispositions. And really, I think what Jesus is trying to get at with the people is like, are you really interested in this? Are you really invested in this? Are you going to give yourself to this notion of the kingdom of God? And we're blessed, we're favored, we're happy when we're in a position to really surrender ourselves and commit ourselves to Jesus' vision for the world. So, yeah. As I remember my sermon, that's what I talked about.
Maybe it'll all start coming back right here.
Oh, yeah. Yes, it's going to come back. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And I liked what you said. It was challenging when I heard you say peacemaking is not the same as being nice.
No, it's just not.
Yeah.
And I take that idea from a church consultant by the name of Bill Easom. And I kept an article of his. I've kept it for years. And the title of the article is Being Nice. And what Bill Easom realized was, so as a church consultant, he went around to congregation after congregation, and he noticed a theme in these churches, especially middle-class, mainline white churches in the United States. He noticed that they bought into the myth that Christianity was all about being nice. And what that did was it created a culture within those organizations where a bully or a strong personality could step into the room and then just dominate where the organization would go. And so the church would come at these crossroads where they should be making these decisions to bring the church forward and do what needs to happen to continue to help it flourish. And what would happen was, because they all wanted to be nice, the strongest personality in the room usually would win the day. And the problem, of course, with that is, if you look at the life of Jesus, Jesus wasn't always nice. And he would go out of his way to heal people he wasn't supposed to heal. He would go out of his way to call out the hypocrisy of the religious people of his time. At one point, he even tells his best friend, Peter, he calls him Satan, which was not very nice.
No.
And then, famously overturned the money changers' tables. So this is our picture of what it looks like to live our lives faithfully for God. Jesus is our picture of what that looks like. So if that's true, then what also becomes true is to be a peacemaker in Jesus's mind isn't always about being nice. It's not about always avoiding conflict. Instead, it's kind of the opposite, really. It's about fiercely loving in such a way that we're willing to endure conflict as a result of it. That's what I see in Jesus.
There's a place for peace, or for being nice. I know our former mayor, who happens to be a friend of mine, Lloyd Winnicky, one of his mottos was nice matters.
Oh, yes. And that's the struggle I had when I was preaching the sermon. It's like, well, being nice is important, yes.
Yeah.
And what I hear Winnicky saying in that moment is similar to some of the things Jesus would go along and say, too,
right,
in the sense that how you go about something inevitably determines what it becomes, right? Like the spirit in which you do something influences how it goes. And when Jesus was having these moments of conflict, I feel like he was coming from a charitable place. He was coming from a generous place. He was experiencing resistance, though, because it was in contrast and in conflict with the pervasive culture around him, both religious culture and the political culture of that time, too. And so the way I've described it to my Sunday school class at times is we're inclusive as Christians, not in spite of our faith, but because of our faith. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that inclusivity, it causes issues, right? Sometimes people aren't happy about inclusivity. And so that's an example of it. And you're interpreted as not being nice sometimes as a result of those things. But, it's the way it goes.
One of the things I came across in my study on this from Eugene Boring and Fred Craddock, and they've got a wonderful commentary on the New Testament, and they say that the Roman emperors called themselves peacemakers and sons of God. Peacemakers does not connote a passive attitude in the way that peacekeepers do. Mm-hmm. So peacekeepers would be the nice people. Mm-hmm. You got to go beyond being nice to actually make peace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think important, and that's fascinating to me, right? That you need to stop and think about this. When Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers," that's a charged comment, hugely charged. Just like when Jesus said, the kingdom of God is at hand, right? So God's kingdom is different than the current kingdom, which is a charged comment. And Peacemakers, this peacemaking beatitude has that same kind of vibe. So what's the difference though, right? Because Caesar and the emperor of Rome they're going to say, hey, we're about peace. And then Jesus is saying, we're about peace. And I think it's the way it's being brought about is the contrast. The Roman way of bringing about peace is really peace through violence. It's peace through military. Through the most powerful military that the world knew at that time, the Roman military. That's the peace that they brought about. Jesus' peace is really a biblical understanding of what peace looks like. It's really a peace that's brought about through what we call justice. And what justice is, it's closely connected to this idea of peace. What justice is it's about working for the flourishing of all people. And so when you're working for peace, you're also working for the flourishing of all people, making sure folks' needs are met, make sure they have enough to sustain their lives. And the idea here is when people are able to flourish, there will be no need for conflict anymore. That's the notion. And so you got the Jesus vision, which is the nonviolent justice vision. You have the Roman vision, which is the more violent vision. And they obviously are very different from one another.
You posed the question about God's mission, and then ask, what is it? What is the mission of God?
Yeah, and that's a complicated question. The way I came down, where I came down was Jesus's mission, Jesus' understanding of things is based upon the non-exclusive love that God has for all people. That basic idea, I think, influences everything Jesus does. And it's echoed in the Gospels themselves. In Matthew 5:9, we get blessed are the peacemakers. About 30 verses later, we have Jesus talking about love for enemies. In the context of love for enemies, Jesus says, though, God sends rain down on the just and the unjust. God sends rain down on the righteous and the unrighteous. And basically what Jesus says in that Matthew 5, in the later part of that chapter, is like, we are going to be called children of God when we love people the way God loves people, right? And so put the two together. Blessed are the peacemakers, they'll be called children of God. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 44, I think it is, Jesus says, when you love your enemies, then you will be called children of God. So in other words, this is what it looks like. And it's based on this non-exclusive love of God that is extended to all people.
And you anticipated some scoffers of this whole idea, like it's just, hey, this can't be relevant, this isn't practical. And then you said, well, sorry. I mean, those are my words.
Right. Well, I knew. I think my exact words in my sermon was like, this is not a Pastor Andy liberal talking point, right? It's not. It's just Jesus. And I've heard a lot of stories, especially recently, where pastors would preach from the Sermon on the Mount in America, and parishioners would confront the pastor after the worship service and say, hey, where'd you get that liberal talking point? Where'd you get that stuff? And this pastor's like, it came from the Sermon on the Mount. It's Jesus. This is as red letter. This is as red letter as we get. This is his sermon. And they're like, oh, that's not relevant. That doesn't work today. And well, okay, well, that's a choice a person can make, but that's not what Jesus said. As far as we know, this is what he said. And clearly, he says that there is grace extended to all people, sinners, righteous, unrighteous, all that, everyone.
Mm-hmm. You talked about subtle enemies. You got into this whole thing about enemies, and you said that we're surrounded by a great cloud of enemies. You want to drill down on that a little?
Well, so in the latter half of my sermon, I remember talking about, so what does it mean to actually live into this idea of peacemaking? What does that look like? And a big part of it, of course, is this idea of loving our enemies, because God, the good news of the gospel is God has no enemies, and so we want to live into that. And what I've noticed in my own life, Randy, is that there are big enemies, right? These are the kind of things we read about a lot of times when we're reading about the events in the world, and these are the things that we're worried are going to happen or mad that happened in our society or something like that, big enemies. But what I've noticed also is there's like subtle enemies in my life. And what I mean by that is there's these things that people do that I don't particularly like or we don't particularly like, and then we label them in our heart enemy. It could be a family member. It could be a church member. It could be a coworker. It could be our spouse. Like in our heart begins to become closed off to them, and they become like an enemy, someone that's against us. And one of the things that really happens then when we fill our heart with these enemies is we begin to become filled with resentment and frustration. We think about revenge. We rehearse, this is what I'm going to say to that person when I get my opportunity. We're going to jump them and then show them how we are right and these kinds of things. And what happens inevitably when our heart is filled with those kinds of voices is we lose a sense of our own peace. It robs us of our own peace. And so I think that's what Jesus is getting at when he says things also like, it is in pardoning that we're pardoned. I think that's that same idea. It's in forgiving that we're forgiven. We begin to pray for our enemies, and since we begin to be delivered of them and let them go. And of course, the enemies were in us. They were living in us. And that's a huge part of what it means to be a peacemaker is we make peace within ourselves by loving our enemies and praying for them.
At the same time, you said that we have to call out evil, anything
Right.
that destroys your life or the life of another. That's what evil is.
Yeah. Well, I got paradoxical there.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the difference. I mean, so that's the first part about loving our enemies and praying for them. We're being nice, right? But then there's another part of this peacemaking idea where we go beyond being nice, and we want to live. We want to work with the love of God to redeem the world from what is evil. And that's a part of the peacemaking idea too, because remember, what's God's desire for the world? That everyone would flourish, right? And so there's these things that happen individually and culturally where it impedes that. It stands in the way of that. And so a peacemaker who's really invested in this will call out evil sometimes and stand against evil in a non-violent way, really, is the ideal here. That's the ideal I think Jesus is putting forth. And so there's big ways we do that in terms of like civil disobedience and protest. That can happen in those ways. But I think just in our day-to-day lives, there's ways in which we do that where, let's say one of those subtle enemies, someone says something to us we don't particularly like. So what do we do then? Well, Jesus gives some very clear directives about that. And later on in Matthew's gospel, I think it's in Matthew 18, he says, if someone does something against you, go talk to them. And then if, they repent, so to speak, then you've gained a brother or sister back, I think is the words Jesus uses there. And there's such a helpful principle in that. So we want to pray for enemies. We want to do good to them. But if someone does something that really hurts us, what Jesus is saying here is go talk to them about it and make it right. In my life as a pastor, sometimes people come talk to me. And a lot of times it's because something happened in their life or someone upset them. And one of the first things I'll say to that person is, well, have you talked to them? And it's interesting because a lot of times, more times than not, they haven't talked to them yet. They wanted to come to me to talk about them.
Right.
And I know there's a place for that. I want to be clear. Sometimes we need to go to a safe person to process things. I get that. And also sometimes in our life, it's not productive to go talk to a person. I get that. But most of the time, a lot of the time, the things that we carry around with us that fills us with a sense of just anger and frustration, a lot of the time, those things that we have with us like that, we can deal with them by simply going to talk to a person. And Jesus is so right on this one. Again, I don't think a person needs to go put themselves in harm's way all over again. I don't think that's the answer always, but just in our day-to-day lives, talking things through is the way to go.
We're so wary of confrontation or getting confrontational, but that's not it. I mean, we're afraid of it, but if we can actually go to that person and begin to talk to them, the fear sort of goes away at that point. Because
it's like you're delivered of a demon almost, right? Yeah, like you exorcise that demon. Yeah. I mean, over the years, I've had people come to talk to me and say, hey, that really hurt me, what you said or what you did. And most of the time, I didn't even know I had done it, right? Mm-hmm. I didn't even know. And in those moments, I said, well, gosh, I'm so sorry, please forgive me. I never intended that, and there was this moment of redemption, really, and healing. You could see that person being delivered of the angst that they were experiencing, and then in a sense we came out of that moment even closer together in our relationship when that happened. And
yeah, it's about relationships. Again, in my own study on this topic, went to one of my favorite commentators, William Barclay, and he says there's one meaning of peace in particular on which the Jewish rabbis love to dwell, and so Jesus. The rabbis held that the greatest task which one can perform is to establish right relationships with one another, and so that requires that kind of discourse, talking it out that we've been discussing.
Well, that's the way Eugene Peterson interprets this Beatitude in the Message Bible. I don't have that passage in front of me, but basically he says, if we're blessed if we can show the world how to cooperate and move through our conflict rather than compete and fight. It's then, I think the way he translated it is, it's then that we realize who we truly are in our place in God's kingdom. And that's a very good way to summarize the spirit of this Beatitude.
Yeah.
So
let's talk about the window before we move on, and because that's what this sermon series is all about. And you always describe the window and what's in it. And of course, that's a matter of interpretation when you look at that.
Yeah. Funny thing is, I'm trying to remember what the window looks like. There was, on the bottom of the window, there were symbols of peace, though. It's been a couple of weeks since I preached this sermon. That's funny. But,
I've got your notes, right?
Oh, you've got my notes.
I've got my notes on your sermon. There's a broken sword.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And which is a symbol of what peace looks like. It's nonviolent. We're trying to break down weapons of war. It's disarming, sure, yes. And then there's the horse's bridle.
Right.
Which, if you know anything about horses, you put a bridle on them so you can steer them. But in the ancient world, that was also used as a symbol of watching our words. So much of the angst in the world is as a result of not watching our words. And then, what was the last one? Yeah.
Lock.
Oh, yeah. That was hard to figure out what that was about. But the way I interpreted that was peacemaking is also is protecting. There's this protecting part of it where you're trying to protect other people too. And God's blessing is extended to us as we go in this direction, as we live our lives in this direction. I remember as I studied the passage, there was a lot of passages in the New Testament where it talks about the Lord of peace. In fact, I feel like there's more phrases like that than there are like a God of love. We talk about loving God, God loves us and these kinds of things all the time. But there's actually more about like, may the Lord of peace be with you, which this is just as a reminder to me how central this idea is if we're going to practice the gospel, the Lord of peace. Like, especially towards the end of some of Paul's writings, he's like, now may the God of peace be with you, these kinds of things. Yeah. The peace that surpasses all understanding, may that be with you, those kinds of things.
Yeah. Okay, so there's that beatitude. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be children of God. I preached last week on this beatitude number 8, verse 10 in chapter 5 of Matthew. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And we talked a little bit earlier about how there's added material when the Beatitudes get down to persecution. But if you look at Luke and you look at the Sermon on the Plain and you look at the 4 blessings and the 4 woes, Luke also includes this extra material about persecution, so it must have been really important. And persecution has been a major theme throughout Christian history. And so, on this particular window, you get at the bottom of that window a representation of the stoning of Stephen. Mm-hmm. So Stephen was, the first Christian martyr, and you have various implements of persecution. You have a fire, and you have a sword, and you have a battle axe, and you have a chain. And you have 2 other martyrs who are unnamed. Maybe we're supposed to be able to figure out who they are, but maybe they're just representative. And then there's a dove at the top of that. And so I started my message, since we saw Stephen there, represented there in that stained window, just to briefly talk about what was going on there. Stephen was one of the 7. There were the 12, and the 12 had duties that they were busy with and didn't want to be responsible for other duties, and so they named the 7, and then Stephen sort of rose to the top of that group right there. And what got him sideways with the leadership was that some Jews accepted Jesus as Messiah and some didn't. And then Stephen said things that those who didn't accept Jesus as the Messiah didn't take kindly. And they ended up stoning him to death. And he was a Christ-like figure in that moment. The scripture says that his face was shining, reminiscent of Moses' face shining when he had his encounter with God.
In that story, doesn't he prays a prayer similar to what Jesus prays in Luke's account?
Forgiveness, yeah.
Yeah. So in Luke's account of the crucifixion, Jesus is like, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And then Acts, which is written by the same author as Luke, he says the same thing. There's the same kind of theme. And in that moment, Stephen's a witness of Christ, the Christ Spirit, when he's praying that way.
Yeah. And so what's important about that, too, is that there's Saul, standing there holding the coats of the guys who were throwing the stones. And so maybe he must have been, or could have been, the ringleader on that. And so we see there the transition, the beginning of the transition from the church in Jerusalem to the church that spread beyond Jerusalem. So even in persecution, there was a purpose that was seen in scattering those Christians out into the world, to spread the message and to spread Christianity. And then I noted that persecution, that was just the first martyr. Persecution has been with us since the beginning of the church, and it's with us today. And I read some statistics, and I won't go through all of those other than to maybe pick out one. But one organization that measures these kinds of things says that more than 365 million Christians, that's 1 in 7, face high levels of persecution for their faith. And then I noted that, isn't it amazing, isn't it miraculous that in this country we are not persecuted? Some folks might want to make a case that we're persecuted, but we're really not. Not in these ways. No, not in those ways. And so I said that on the one hand, that's a very good thing. If I asked for a show of hands, you wouldn't get any hands going up saying, bring on the persecution. But on the other hand, we miss out on something, really, because we're not persecuted. It's just a wonderful gift that we have that somebody else, paid for. Not that I'm asking for persecution, but we know even when we are opposed, not to the point of persecution, that it creates in us a response that often leads to growth, right? Mm-hmm. So I said I could cite stories about Christian martyrs down through the ages, but I just wanted to share one story because it moved me deeply. I had never heard it until about 3 or 4 years ago when I was taking a Christian history course, and I heard the story of a couple of 3rd century martyrs, Perpetua and Felicitas. And I won't tell the whole story, but as I said, that stayed with me. Like for 3 or 4 days, I couldn't get it out of my mind. It was in the year 203, and it happened in North Africa in the city of Carthage, Roman Carthage. That's modern day Tunisia, and the Roman emperor was Septimus Severus, and persecution took different forms through the years.
It was sporadic.
Yeah, it was sporadic. And
I think it's important for people to realize that they would go through these seasons where they weren't being executed. Christians wouldn't necessarily be executed for what they believed. They were held with suspicion because they were a new movement. If you think about it, like what we do today when something's new, we're like, well, I don't know about that. But there was these moments like it would bubble up. And a lot of times it was the governors. Not necessarily the emperor that would do it, is right. What I've read is and in North Africa, my hunch is maybe not the emperor said execute these people, but it was more probably something locally
on the local level. Yeah. But Severus, the way he handled it at the time was he was just trying to stop the growth of Christianity. Okay. If you were already a Christian, you were sort of grandfathered in. but he wanted to prevent the spread. There weren't all that many Christians yet in North Africa, but it was growing, and he wanted to stop the spread. So he outlawed conversion. And so that's what makes this story interesting, because Perpetua was a 22-year-old noble woman, highly educated, well-to-do, nursing a baby boy. Felicitas was Perpetua's servant. She was 8 months pregnant. And the two of them, along with 3 of their male counterparts, including Perpetua's brother, were catechumens. And catechumens are converts.
In the process of it.
Yeah. So
interesting.
Yeah, and so they've been converted to Christianity. They're getting instruction for their baptism, and so they got arrested. They got arrested, and this is what's fascinating about this. We know about this because Perpetua kept a diary, so she could read and she could write, and she could write well. And so she kept this diary. Now, there are doubters. I didn't bring this up in the sermon. There are doubters, but there are also well-respected authorities that think she really did write this. These really are her words. And so when they're arrested, a big theme in my sermon was her father, because as a father, I could relate to the father. He was so distressed about what his daughter was doing. All she had to do was just renounce her Christianity, and she could live and spare him the pain, and of course her the pain, and her whole family the pain. But in the famous story, she says to her father, "Look at this water pot, Father. What is it?" He said, "Well, it's a water pot. Could we call it anything else?" And he said, "Well, I suppose we can." And she said, "And I can't be called anything else either. I'm a Christian. I'm a Christian." So she was baptized. Yeah. And they were put into prison. And she got permission for her baby to stay with her. And this is another really sweet part of the story. She says that at that moment, when she got her baby back there in prison, that prison suddenly became a palace for her. So
that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So her brother says, "Wow, you've got something going on here, the depth of your faith. Why don't you ask God for a vision, about what's going on?" And so God grants Perpetua this vision, and in that vision, she sees a ladder going up into heaven, and there's a serpent at the base of it, and she steps on its head and climbs the ladder, gets to the top, and sees a shepherd milking sheep. And then the shepherd gives her a drink of this milk, and her cupped hand, she drinks it. And as she comes to from the vision, she's still tasting milk and honey. And apparently, in North Africa, at First Communion, you don't get wine, you get milk and honey.
Interesting.
Reflective of the Promised Land.
Yeah, it's really, yeah.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah. And so by that vision, she knew that she was bound for heaven, but she would have to suffer, on the way to getting there. And then the father comes charging back, "Have pity on my gray head, spare yourself." And this came up in my Sunday school class after. One of the people in the Sunday school class said, "Couldn't she just have put her hand, crossed her fingers behind her back, and renounced Christianity and then gone on with it?" And I said she could have, and sometimes there was even a kind of an option for that.
Yeah.
But you would miss the spiritual benefits of truly sticking, because God gave her all these wonderful visions, which kept it together for her.
Right. I know.
Yeah.
I mean, I've read that where, the Romans wouldn't ask Christians to necessarily renounce their faith, but they were basically asking them to make sacrifice to the Roman gods.
Right.
Because the Romans believed that as long as they kept the gods happy, then Rome would keep winning their wars and various things. And so that's one of the big reasons why the Romans really didn't like Christians, because they were worried because the Christians would not sacrifice to the Roman gods, that the Roman gods would become angry with them. And so they were concerned about that, obviously, for various reasons. And so sometimes they would give them the option, though, where they could just make sacrifice, and you go about your business. You can go on and do what you want to on Sunday. We don't care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. They would there was a multiplicity of religions, and in order to unify this growing empire, they needed to let people do their thing just for the sake of unity, of nothing else. And so, but just to acknowledge, that's all they wanted in many cases, just to acknowledge that the emperor, he's worthy of praise as well. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, they called the emperor son of God, too. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so just remember that in the Gospels when they say Jesus is the Son of God. In that context, the emperor was son of God. So they're saying Jesus' vision is God's vision, not Caesar's. It's a big statement.
Yeah.
Anyway.
It's an in-your-face statement. So they go off to the trial, and then at this point I went ahead and I read from the diary, and now that we're into the story, let's just go on through it. But Perpetua writes, we arrived at the forum, and straight away the story went about the neighborhood near the forum, and a huge crowd gathered. We walked up to the prisoner's dock. All the others, when questioned, admitted their guilt. Then, when it came my turn, my father appeared with my son, dragged me from the step, and said, "Perform the sacrifice. Have pity on your baby." The governor, who had received the judicial powers, you were talking about the governor probably, who was carrying out all this on the local level, said to me, "Have pity on your father's gray head. Have pity on your infant son. Offer the sacrifice for the welfare of the emperors." "I will not," I retorted. "Are you a Christian?" said the governor. And I said, "Yes, I am." And the father just loses it at this point. She's just insisting that she's a Christian. She's not going to get off of that. And so he got so upset that they had to just beat him down with rods. And they were sentenced to death, sentenced to be thrown to the wild beasts in the arena. She sent for her baby, who was with the father. He refused to take the baby back. But again, here's another little miracle and a spiritual benefit that she got, that even at that moment when she couldn't get her baby back, the baby's desire for the breast ceased, and Perpetua suffered no discomfort in her breasts because of it. Yeah.
You said this happened around the year 200 in North Africa?
203, yeah.
And then it's fascinating to me, 300 years later, you fast forward another century, and Christianity is no longer a suspicious sect that we're scared about, the Romans were scared about. Instead, they became the official state religion.
Right.
And then, of course, if you know history, move forward into the Middle Ages after the fall of the Roman Empire, and Christianity becomes the biggest show in town. Instead of the Christians being persecuted, the Christians become the ones that do the persecution, right? Like they go off on the Crusades and things like that. Yeah, I always find that interesting. It flips.
Yeah. That is.
That's a beautiful story with her, challenging for sure.
Yeah. So the diary, she has a couple of more visions. She has a vision of her little brother who died of cancer at 7 years old, and in the vision, he was still sick. She could still see him in all his illness, and so for the next several days she prayed, and then she got another vision, and she saw him healed, and she saw a vision where she was fighting an Egyptian in the arena, and this is a funny little quirk in the story. She turns into a man so that she would have the strength to defeat this Egyptian, and she sees the Egyptian as the devil. And so again, this is a vision from God that she's going to go into the arena, but she's going to come out victorious. And so then the diary ends right there. And so here I read directly from the writer who took over the story. The day of their victory dawned, and they marched from the prison to the amphitheater joyfully, as though they were going to heaven. With calm faces, trembling, if at all, with joy rather than fear, Perpetua went along with shining countenance and calm step as the beloved of God, as the wife of Christ, putting down everyone's stare by her own intense gaze. With them also was Felicitas, glad that she had safely given birth, so that now she could fight the beasts, going from one bloodbath to another, from the midwife to the gladiator, ready to wash after childbirth in a second baptism. So what happened with Felicitas was she was 8 months pregnant. There was a law that a pregnant woman could not be executed, and so she agonized over the fact that she wouldn't be able to die with her companions, and so they got another miracle. She gave birth to the baby, and she was able to go into the arena and die with her companions. And so the wild beasts were turned on those companions. they lived. They remained, but they lived. Then they turned a mad heifer loose on Perpetua and Felicitas, and then they lined them all up, and they all died by the sword. But as the story goes, the swordsman hit a bone on Perpetua, and so Perpetua then guided the tip of the sword to the place where it should have gone, and she died. Yeah.
Well, that's intense.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
Huh.
So, and then the footnote to this is that a couple hundred years later, the passion of Perpetua and Felicitas was held in such high esteem still that another North African, St. Augustine, had to warn his listeners not to put this story on the level with the canonical scriptures. Mm-hmm. Isn't that amazing that
it was an important part of the narrative of the church at that time?
It was their experience.
This is what success looks like in the faith.
Yes, and that kind of thing can happen outside of the canon.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. God continues to speak.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'll wrap this up by posing the question that I asked of our congregation as they came for communion. I just said, if it was illegal to be a Christian, would you be a Christian? Mm. And more to the point, would you be a Christian if it was illegal to be a Christian and the penalty for being a Christian was death? Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, it's one to ponder.
It is. It makes us ask, what's my real motivation for being a Christian? Is it just because I happened to be born in a Christian family, happened to be born in a society that by and large historically has embraced Christianity? As the United States, Christianity continues to be a major religion that influences our society, even though the statistics are changing a bit. But so
it says something about the difference between growing up in the faith and being converted to the faith too. I think that's an aspect of this. I mean, I've often wondered, because I grew up in the faith, you certainly grew up in the faith. When I asked the question in my Sunday school class, everybody grew up in the faith. So we got it as an inheritance, but how much different would it be if we were converted to it?
Right.
Yeah.
If it was, our choice, so to speak.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's just interesting to think about the martyrdom and the early church, the patristic era, kind of is like, I would say it's about a year 100 once the New Testament's done, and then it goes to about 400-ish in there before the Middle Ages. That's the patristic era, the early church. And this is what it looked like to be a successful Christian. This is what it looked like to be a faithful Christian. A Christian was someone that kind of stood on the margins of society and stood against the empire and stood against what it was about and stood against the empire's religion. And so as people that are in the United States, it's hard for us to understand what that's like, right? And that's kind of what I hear you getting at.
Yeah.
That's what it's like. Because in our culture today, Christianity, I'll just say in Evansville, Indiana, we're still the home team, right? We're not standing on the margins. Everywhere you go, even people who don't go to church, if you ask them, they're going to say, "Oh, well, yeah, I'm a Christian,"
Yeah.
And I don't know. I find that interesting. So, what's it look like to be a faithful Christian in the United States today? Mm-hmm. What's that look like? Does it look like a person who affirms our culture? Mm-hmm. Does it look like a person that just goes along with it? Or if we were going to apply the early church vision, does it look more like this group's like, I'm not going to make sacrifices to your gods. No. Yeah. I'm not doing it. I mean, I'll let the listeners figure that one out. That's why it's always so challenging to me, right?
It is.
There's so many things we enjoy as Americans. So many things we enjoy. And we assume. Mm-hmm. And we go along with. Yeah. Because our culture goes along with it, but clearly Jesus would not go along with a lot of the things that are happening.
And it's worth thinking about it, because while we're not persecuted today, we could be persecuted someday.
We could.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a lot of the times it's the persecution, the conflict. The conflict comes not from non-Christians. It's Christians in conflict with other Christians in our world, because not every version of Christianity sees faithfulness in the same ways. And in the podcast, I've often said, it's not Christianity, it's Christianities.
Right.
There's competing visions of what it looks like to be a faithful follower of Jesus. And it needs to be said that that's the case, because that is clearly the case. And so, and that was kind of similar early on too, in early Christianity, the New Testament Christianity, when there's conflict, especially being mentioned in the Gospels, it's conflict within Judaism, right? It's conflict within that religion itself. And so that's, in some ways, we're similar in that way now, because now there's conflict within our religion. There's conflict what that looks like. And so, anyway.
All right, quick preview of this Sunday.
Oh, so
Beatitude number 10 or 11, or 9 or 10.
it's blessed are those who hear the word of God and do it.
Yeah.
And I'll just pose the question I'm going to ask. That's going to define my sermon is, what's your religion? What is it? I get that question from G.K. Chesterton, who is arguably one of the most influential Christian thinkers of the 20th century. C.S. Lewis, for example, said that Chesterton is the greatest apologist that he knew. So Chesterton influenced C.S. Lewis. So just think about that one for a moment. So what Chesterton said was, a person's religion is not where they go to church. Instead, it is the cosmos that they live in. Gosh, that's a microphone drop, right? I heard that, I read that, and I was like, whoa. What is my religion? It's not the sect that I belong to. It's not just like United Methodist. I'm a United Methodist pastor. No. My real religion is the cosmos I live in. It's how I see the world around me.
And live it out.
Yeah. That's it.
Yeah.
And so what does it mean to make the Word of God central to my life? It's really about talking through this idea of, well, how do you see the world? How do you see your neighbor? Those kinds of things. That's the word. That's the message. Anyway, we're going to go there with it.
Very good. We will look forward to that, and we will wrap this up. I do want to mention that the sermons, then we're always talking about these sermons, but another way to take in the sermon is through the podcast. I mean, you can get it, the virtual worship, but it's also on the podcast. And I've talked to people who listen to the sermon more than once, which is a good practice.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you. We're getting our numbers up.
That's right. That's right.
No, it is helpful. I mean, I listened to your sermon on the podcast this week too, Randy, as I was running in the mornings, and I find that to be a helpful way to digest these kinds of things, especially sermons or podcasts. That way of learning helps me a lot.
Yep. It's all there for you. So thank you very much for listening. We hope you have a great week this week, and we will talk to you again next week.
This has been the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. You are welcome to join us at Methodist Temple in person or online. Methodist Temple is at 2109 Lincoln Avenue in Evansville, Indiana. Our traditional Sunday morning worship service is at 8:30 with our contemporary service at 11. Log on to our website at methodisttemple.church. We see Christ in you.